of the 20th century. But one of the hardest fought wars of all was in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. For 3 weeks, the battle swung violently from side to side. It brought each within sight of victory and defeat. And it brought the superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, close to a nuclear showdown.
The Israelis were in no doubt they were fighting for their country's very survival. For the soldiers of Syria and Egypt, it was a battle for Arab territory and Arab pride.
In this program, I'll be revealing how Arab and Israeli commanders astonished each other with the boldness of their strategy.
And I'll be finding out how both sides used the latest weaponry with shattering results.
No 20th century conflict has been as lasting and bitter as the struggle between Israel and its Arab neighbors. This is the story of the biggest battle between them. It's still such a sensitive subject in Egypt that they wouldn't let us film there. This is the story of the October War of 1973.
This concrete security barrier here runs through Jerusalem and hundreds of miles to the north and the south. On this side live predominantly Muslim Palestinian Arabs. On this side, the largely Jewish population of Israel. The 8-meter high barrier, which the Israelis started building in 2002, is the most powerful symbol of the hostility between Jews and Arabs, which still remains after nearly a century of conflict. The Israelis say that they built this barrier to keep out Palestinian terrorists. The Palestinians say it's just Israel's way of grabbing more of their land. And that's what this conflict has always been about: land. Land known at the beginning of the 20th century as Palestine.
Back in 1917, the British controlled Palestine, and they promised the Jews a homeland here. The problem was, there were more than 10 times as many Arabs as Jews already living in Palestine. And as hundreds of thousands more Jews poured into the country, open fighting broke out between them. By 1947, things were so bad, the United Nations stepped in with a plan. This is how Palestine looked then. Lying on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, it was bordered by Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Egypt. The United Nations suggested partition. The Palestinians would keep land here, here, and here, and the Jews would have the rest. Jerusalem would be an open city shared by everyone. The Jews accepted the plan, and in 1948 they declared their independence as the State of Israel. But the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab countries rejected partition. War followed, and the borders changed once more. The Israelis took over Arab lands here in the north and along the Egyptian border, ending up with most of Palestine and most of the key city of Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes. These refugees headed to neighboring Arab countries, creating a refugee crisis that lasts to this day.
One night everyone was awakened to the sound of people. Go, go, the Jews are coming. I can still recall the voice and the ensuing chaos. Within a short period of time, the entire village was marching out, carrying bare essentials, bedding on a mule, some clothing, some food.
The Arabs refused to recognize this new state of Israel, and their resentment at the loss of Palestinian homes and land grew. For their part, the Israelis felt vulnerable, surrounded on all sides by hostile Arab enemies. Over the next 20 years, there was regular fighting along the borders.
In 1967, things finally came to a head. On the morning of June the 5th, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt. It was followed hours later by attacks on Egypt's allies, Syria and Jordan. It would become known as the Six-Day War.
Almost 200 pilots of the Israeli Air Force took part in an incredibly ambitious airstrike. Their mission was to wipe out the Egyptian Air Force, the largest in the Arab world. In just under 2 hours, Israeli bombs destroyed almost the entire Egyptian Air Force before it had even got off the ground. Next, Israel launched strikes on the air forces of Jordan and Syria. By the end of the day, Israeli pilots had won total control of the skies.
Not very far away, there were some military bases, and they had been attacked early in the morning. There was nothing announced, and we didn't know what was going on. Defeat was unfolding right there.
Israeli ground troops stormed into Syria, Jordan and Egypt. At the same time, other Israeli troops made a bid to capture Arab-held Jerusalem. On June the 7th, just 2 days into the war, Israeli paratroopers charged through this gate into the old city. But as they pushed through these narrow streets, they came under fire from Jordanian snipers who'd taken up position in the upper stories of the buildings on either side. The Israelis pushed on. It took them a few hours to clear out these last pockets of resistance, but by early afternoon, the whole of Jerusalem was in Israeli hands.
I took out the Israeli flag, which I carried with me the whole time, and waved it. I hung the flag on the fence. My commander, who was the toughest among us, was standing next to me. He burst into tears underneath his steel helmet. Another friend was weeping. A chain of bullets wrapped around his neck.
In the days that followed, Israeli troops drove back the soldiers of Jordan, Syria and Egypt.
Created the conditions where the two sides could come together. Peace was as far away as ever. For the Arabs, the Six-Day War was an utter disaster. Before this whirlwind campaign, Israel had been a tiny wedge of land, squeezed between Arab states, only 9 miles wide at its narrowest. Suddenly, it was a Middle East superpower, and 5 times the size. The borders had been pushed back to swallow a piece of Syria up here, called the Golan Heights. To the east, Israel had seized the West Bank, And in the south, it now occupied Egypt's entire Sinai Peninsula, a huge expanse of desert. From this newfound position of strength, Israel's leaders demanded that the Arab world recognize the state of Israel. Arab leaders met in Sudan to formulate their response. They were emphatic. They would not recognize Israel and insisted on a total Israeli withdrawal from the territories it had just occupied. Over the next few years, both sides became entrenched, and nowhere was this more visible than along the new border with Egypt. The Suez Canal. The canal is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, allowing ships to pass between Europe and Asia without sailing round Africa. But after the Six-Day War, this international waterway was closed to shipping as sporadic fighting between both sides continued to flare up.
The Israelis and the Egyptians now faced each other eyeball to eyeball across the canal. The Egyptians could never accept that this was a permanent frontier. But the Israelis were equally determined. Egyptians now watched in horror as the Israeli military machine went to work. All along the Suez Canal, the Israelis built a massive network of walls, forts and trenches that became known as the Bar Lev Line. Israel resolved that Egypt would never force its way back into the Sinai. But they weren't just relying on the Bar Lev Line for defense. The Israelis also had a system for rushing troops to the front line. Israel has a small population and can't afford a large standing army. So every male Israeli does 3 years national service and remains a reservist into his 40s or 50s, ready to be mobilized in times of war. Today, females also do national service and they can also be called up if war breaks out. 30 years ago, an army of 250,000 men could be mobilized within 72 hours if the Arabs showed signs of attacking. But after the Six-Day War, that didn't seem very likely.
The Israelis had practically destroyed Arab air power. Israeli intelligence was now sure the Arabs wouldn't try anything until they'd rebuilt their air forces. And that would take another 10 years. The Israelis were now supremely confident that if their neighbors so much as twitched, they would batter them into submission once more. But in Cairo, something had happened that the Israelis hadn't reckoned with. A new Egyptian president with a new sense of purpose, Anwar Sadat. When Sadat came to power in 1970, Egypt was still a demoralized country, smarting from the loss of the Sinai. Sadat was considered a moderate by many, but one of the first things he did was appoint a dynamic and popular new military commander, General Saad el-Shazli. Shazli was given the job of revitalizing Egypt's poorly trained and under-equipped army, because Sadat was determined to do what the Israelis least expected: fight back. Sadat had decided that the only way to win back the Sinai from the Israelis was to make war on them. His plan was to launch a spectacular crossing of the canal and retake a strip of land in the Sinai. Sadat hoped that this would force the Israelis to negotiate a withdrawal from the rest of Sinai. But for this plan to work, Sadat was going to need help. Sadat found a willing ally in the Soviet Union, as the Israelis had with the USA. In the 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were adamant that neither superpower would dominate the oil-rich Middle East. The Soviets provided Egypt with the latest surface-to-air missiles, called SAMs. These missiles, supported by thousands of conventional anti-aircraft guns, could effectively paralyze the Israeli Air Force. The Egyptian commander, General Shazli, would not have to rely on his weakened air force to deal with Israeli warplanes. Nor would Sadat attack alone. Another of his allies, President Assad of Syria, would be joining in the fight. The key to the Egyptian plan was a surprise coordinated ground attack on Israel. The Syrians would attack on the Golan at exactly the same moment as the Egyptians struck along the entire length of the canal. But Shazli knew that no matter how stunned the Israelis might be by this two-pronged offensive, they would soon counterattack with their most lethal weapon, their air force. And that was where the SAM missiles came in. Shazli concentrated his SAMs along the Suez Canal. These missiles could bring down any Israeli planes that came within 15 miles. The SAMs and regular artillery guns would create a protective umbrella, shown here in red, under which Egyptian boats and infantry could cross safely. They would then seize the forts of the Bar-Lev line and secure a strip of land a few miles deep into the Sinai. The date of the attack was set for October the 6th, when the tides would give the most favourable conditions for crossing the canal. But October the 6th was also the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, when Israelis would be at home or the synagogue. With their plans in place, the Egyptians and their Syrian allies set about ensuring that the Israelis had no idea they were about to be attacked on two fronts.
The Egyptians put into effect a complicated deception plan to try and lull Israeli military intelligence into complacency. They had been gradually mobilizing their reserves, but at the beginning of October, they demobilized 20,000 men and sent them home. From what the Israelis could see, it didn't look like the Egyptian army was gearing up for war. As for the Egyptian soldiers based beside the canal, they were told to act as if nothing much was up. They could go swimming and bask in the sun in full view of the Israeli troops in the forts of the Bar-Lev line. Any military activity the Israeli lookouts did spot appeared to be just another regular exercise. By day, they watched as Egyptian troops came close to the canal to carry out maneuvers. At night, they appeared to head back inland to their barracks many miles away. Hundreds of miles to the north, the Syrians on the Golan appeared to be doing the same. But in fact, these troops weren't withdrawing every evening. Under cover of darkness, more and more Arab soldiers were massing on both fronts.
We started to train with real ammunition. We were also told we were going to Suez. We started to take our tanks, our amphibious unit on the railroad at night only, so the civilians couldn't see.
Reports of all this Egyptian activity were given to the heads of Israel's military intelligence. There'd been a number of false alarms in the past, and they were convinced that this was just another one. But they were wrong. At 4:30 a.m. on the 6th of October, the day of Yom Kippur, the phone rang at the home of Israel's military chief, General David Elazar. Elazar had been made Israeli Chief of Staff after a long military career and a host of victories. The call from Israeli military intelligence informed him that both Egypt and Syria would launch an attack in hours. Elazar's immediate thought was to send his air force to hit the Arabs before they had a chance to strike. But that decision could only be taken in the halls of power by Israel's politicians. And ultimately, that meant one person, Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir. This 75-year-old was seen as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics. But she said no to airstrikes. She argued that if Israel was to win international support after the Six-Day War, it had to be seen not as the aggressor, but the victim. Elazar was appalled at his leader's reaction. He was only given permission to mobilize a fraction of the reservists he needed, and yet, within a few hours, his country would face invasion on two fronts. Egypt and Syria were poised to launch their attack.
Just before 2 o'clock, the Egyptians put their part of the plan into action. Their assault across the canal on the forts of the Bar Lev line was such a momentous event in Egyptian history, it was later restaged for the cameras. Thousands of Egypt's best-trained commandos crossed the Suez Canal in rubber dinghies. They landed on the east bank in the gaps between the forts of the Bar Lev line. The Egyptian commandos then scrambled up the high sand ramparts. They attached rope ladders to make it easier for the soldiers following on behind them. Behind this first wave were 100,000 Egyptian infantry and more than 1,000 tanks waiting to cross the canal, but the biggest obstacle to them were the giant sand ramparts on the Israeli side. These were as much as 60 feet in height. It was impossible for the Egyptian tanks and heavy artillery to climb up and over them. The Egyptians experimented with using dynamite to blow holes in them, but this was found to take far too long. But then one junior engineer officer had a flash of genius. He suggested using high-pressure hoses to blast the ramparts with water from the canal. It was an extraordinary idea which would have to work if the entire Egyptian assault was to be a success. 4 hours into the attack, and with fighting raging around them, the Egyptian engineers finally broke through the ramparts, and the first tanks started to pour through.
I never believed I would see the day when I was in Sinai. But this was actually Sinai. I looked back at the West Bank and all the green on the other side, and to the east, all I could see is desert. It was good feeling.
The eastern bank of the canal now became a battlefield. The Israelis manning the forts sprayed machine gun fire at their Egyptian attackers to try and stem the tide. But within 2 hours, 23,000 of Egypt's infantry were on the east bank and had advanced up to 1 mile into Sinai.
The fort was surrounded by Egyptian forces and was under constant fire. We made repeated calls for help. We fired from time to time and reported back what we saw. But mainly, we tried to keep up our morale.
But the Israelis were sure that their air force would come to the rescue. The first Israeli jets were sent in at 4 p.m., flying low over the desert. But as they approached the canal, they found themselves under attack from the ground. The Egyptian SAM missiles and anti-aircraft guns caused havoc. As Israeli planes were shot down that afternoon, it soon became clear that Egypt's elaborate air defense umbrella was working.